Howdy folks, I'm Caleb Sunstead, your host, and normally the Game Master of Sounds Like Crows, but instead today I'm hosting Fireside with Rob Stith, and I hope I just pronounced your last name right.
You did. You're one of the few and the proud.
Well, every time you talk about it, your Twitter handle is Rob of the
Lord
Stith,
of the
right?
Stith.
Lord of the Stith, which is possibly the best Twitter handle.
This is a Star Wars pun that follows me all the way back to middle school, so.
Is that annoying, or is that the greatest thing that's ever happened to you?
Both. I mean, it was annoying, and then I, grew to the age where I realized that the planet's dying and that everything sucks and nothing matters, and it was like, oh man, that's a great pun. I'm glad that's still that's
and then
still
you
something
like Star
I can draw
Wars.
on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've listened to not all of your podcast. I'm sorry to you. I'm sorry, dear listener.
It is sizable.
It's very long. Yeah,
it's not even halfway done either.
Oh my God, dude. Well, I am excited because I do a thing with podcasts where I'll load up the first episode, and if the first episode's with actual plays, if the first episode's bad audio, then I'll skip to episode 10. If it's still bad, I'll skip to episode 20.
Right.
And if none of those are good, then I peace out. But I was pleasantly surprised to load yours up. Beautiful, crisp audio. I think just the first session, I hope that was all one session. I don't want to give spoilers, but yeah, the first arc you have, man, the punch in the house, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
That was it. I was sold. So I'm making my way through, but I figured we'd get you on now because timely, you've just launched a Kickstarter. I think at the time this releases, it'll probably be within the last week or so.
Yeah, it was on the 7th of May that it went up initially.
It's the system you've been playtesting on your podcast that you made, yeah?
Yeah, part of the process of testing the game, I decided, basically instead of running a million one-shots with a bunch of different randos, I thought, if I'm going to have to do this large amount of gaming to possibly get the game ready, why not find people who I'm excited about playing a lot with and do a campaign that has has an emotional reward for long-term investment.
Dang.
And have that be the way that we test it. We can handle the rules getting tweaked here and there and, make a big epic campaign out of it. And that is what we did. And I don't know exactly what convinced me that I should record it aside from just my admiration for Jim McClure and Cat Cool.
Sure, yeah.
But I said to give it a try, and it worked out really well. People had pretty natively good mic discipline, not perfect, but not disastrous at all.
Sure, yeah.
And everyone had good enough microphones, and we just went with it and started having a lot of fun. It's
really good. It's so I describe Crows as horror, western, steampunk. How would you describe Orpheus?
Oh, man.
Horror, spycraft.
Yeah, I mean, it's what if the X-Files were investigated by the X-Men, but there was a conspiracy going on in the background that they didn't know about, which I guess just makes it the X-Files again. So, sure, it's eldritch, cosmic horror, but players, as they develop, their characters gain access to a lot of power. They become quite super heroic, but of course the trick is that in a cosmic horror setting, it doesn't matter how strong you get. You're still going to be fighting at a disadvantage against an existential, threat. I wanted to have a game and a campaign podcast, consequently, where you're doing horror, but you also have long-term character development. You don't just have characters dropping like flies and not having a chance to settle in and matter.
Right.
Because there's plenty of that already in terms of horror. And I wanted to explore a different potential side of this genre that I'm fond of.
I don't know if you intended it to be this way, but it seems like the system, when you're listening to it, the system seems to be set up in a way where normal things will be happening and the characters feel very proficient. There are mechanics that just say, hey, I just choose to roll decently well on this roll, and stuff like that, where in everyday situations they're doing fine, and then you get to those levels of cosmic horror, and then just out of nowhere it's, hey, you're making this roll in Savage Worlds terms, it's just hey, you're making this roll at -8, so good luck,
That's intentional because that mechanically sets up a contrast between the stuff that these competent secret paramilitary agents are going to be way better than you need to be good at versus the true horror. If you show the people to be super competent and then they still struggle and sometimes die or lose their minds against the actual horror of the scenario, you've sort of, by contrast, established the stakes.
Yeah.
And the scale in that way. And also, just in general, on a more game design geek bent for that, very few things feel shittier than having a character who's supposed to be good at something and you can't roll well to save your life, and there's nothing you can do, and you just suck and you fail and you're miserable. This is coming from someone who has played D&D and had a session where 30 die rolls in a row never broke double digits on a D20, and
that's rough.
There's nothing in that game to mitigate that. If your luck is that bad, you will just not have a good time, period. And I was really interested in not having that be anyone's, even a marginal percentage of experiences with my game. I don't want anyone to have that experience.
I think you're right that's a problem that a lot of people... Man, maybe we shouldn't bash D&D too much, Rob, but I love D&D.
There's a cottage industry of bashing D&D, and I've partaken in it plenty myself, but it's the reason we're here, so fair dues, but...
I think you're right in that there is a large amount of things in that game where the GM can mitigate it, but nowhere in any of the books does it tell you how to do that.
Right. No. And this is compounded, of course, by a cultural aversion to so-called railroading.
Yes.
That, obviously they needed to write some guidelines about what kind of GM interventions are good and allowable and things like that, because obviously the entire hobby and the entire internet has gotten its undergarments in a twist about what's okay for a GM to do and what's not.
A lot of those discussions, I feel like, are made by people that are ill-informed or haven't thought the issue through, or haven't
you just described
enough.
98% of humanity, so yes.
But to get away from that topic, I think you handled that very well in Orpheus. Like you said, it seems like all the characters, they feel really competent at what they do. Was that something that took a while to accomplish? What was the playtesting process like for this? Because was it just the show, the Orpheus Protocol?
I think basically there was a game I ran at a con. There was one game I ran off mics. But the third session of the first draft of the rules being run is part of the Shudder, the first arc of the podcast.
Okay.
So that's about as far as that goes. Yeah, that was that was very early days in terms of the development of the game.
I haven't gotten as far as you in creating anything. I'm very impressed by the fact that you made it to a Kickstarter level, but I had this friend when I was 10 or 13, and we'd always make games together. That was our main hobby. Mm-hmm. And I felt like we always got to a point in which the game just broke. And unless we wanted to rip out half of the core mechanics, it just didn't work. And that would always be our discussion, and we kind of give up at that point. Is there anything that you ran into in developing Orpheus that none of the advice that you had read or had been given prepared you for?
Kind of, but not in a way, I think, at the end of the day, that can provide any specificity in advice that I then generate. But I think that perhaps the best way to approach this question is the thing I wish that I would have known before starting developing on the game. If I had known how to separate important critical feedback from good but off-message or off-center feedback from bad feedback. That is an amazing skill that I don't know how to actually actively develop in this or in any other field, but that's really, really helpful because obviously, once you start exposing a creative project, to say nothing of a game with codified rules, to a large number of people, you are going to get some feedback that following would destroy the thing.
Just
full stop. And plenty of feedback that seems reasonable, but directly contradicts other reasonable seeming feedback. And you're going to get some feedback that's going to make your project a hell of a lot better if you follow or slightly adapt. And knowing the difference between those things is going to save you an infinitude of headaches, basically, down the line. But I don't really know how to tell people how to do that. Just try to practice, I guess. But like one of the things that this leads to is kind of a development kudzu situation where you make what you think it should be, and then you run into new situations that maybe there isn't a rule to cover, and maybe you're thinking of making a new rule. And then other people who are playtesting it or listening to it or whatever also bring to your attention new things. And the temptation is to just keep addressing each thing.
Right.
And of course, then the result of that is that you have way too many fucking rules. And it's like impossible for anyone but you to run.
Yeah.
And maybe impossible for you to run actually fully 100% by the book. And so you need to understand what the central point, the tone, the intended emotional impact of your game is, so that you have some kind of Rosetta Stone and some sort of North Star for guiding the development of the game, so that you're not just like wandering off on all these tangents that make the whole thing as a package harder to consume, harder to digest, harder to understand.
Yeah.
And you need to just learn to let it go in some ways, in terms of just allowing some situations and some things to not be strongly covered by your game as written. Like, if it's something that's super important to a small niche of people, let them house rule it. You need to be making a game that makes sense and stays on message in its construction and its presentation.
Is there any feedback you took for your show that changed the way you run or produce it?
Gosh, not really. Most of my motivation for developing any new techniques for recording, editing, producing, running for the show is just pure unleaded imposter syndrome. Like I hate everything I make plenty, to the point where I'm definitely always going to be trying to improve it just to reduce the level to which it makes me want to climb out of my skin. Hearing it back. So I think that that's honestly been the biggest thing. I've had so much, and I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about this, but people have been so damn nice to me about like how it sounds, like how easy it is to listen to. And even mostly stuff about the game. There have been some good criticisms about certain things where I had over-designed it. But like in terms of the actual show, everyone's been so nice, and it's like, oh my god, how can these people not realize that I'm just a idiot baby? And it's just trying to live up to all these nice things people are saying about me that drives most of my development in all these different skill sets that wrap into it.
That's an issue I'm deeply passionate about. Have you read The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss?
Many times.
Many times. Okay, well, I describe working on a project. The only way to make a good project is a bit like sympathy magic in that book. Now, for the listener, and to remind myself, there's this one scene where he's defending a candle, and he's trying to light his opponent's candle with his blood, and then he's trying to stop his opponent from lighting his candle. And the way he describes it is that you have to hold two concepts in your mind at once. You have to believe that your blood and the candle wick are the same so that you can use the heat to light it. But at the same time, you don't want the cold of the candle to touch your blood. So at the same time, you have to believe that you and the candle are not the same. And you have to hold those two concepts in your mind. Not just hold them. You have to genuinely believe that both of those things are true. So I say the same thing is true with making a show, except you have to hold that this is the biggest piece of shit that anyone has ever made on planet Earth. And then secondly, you have to believe that you are the greatest fucking thing that's ever been given to the earth, you know? And then somewhere in between those, you'll find a happy medium.
Yeah, there's the path to wisdom. It's true. I mean, there are aspects of both of those beliefs that are helpful, because you can't just be crushed by negativity and give up, because then there's no more show. But you also have to be willing to improve and not buy your own hype or anything like that. And so I think it's like you need to be able to functionally see yourself and your project as flawed but perfectible.
Sure, yeah.
Like the Star Trek view of humanity, I guess.
Yeah.
and like be compassionate to yourself and respectful to your critics.
That's pretty rich coming from you that runs such a dark fucking show, dude.
You'll find it's a very compassionate show, though. One of the guiding lights in the way that I tell stories is I don't show hideous, horrible things happening for like some sort of puerile shock value. It's like turning the contrast up as high as possible on the empathy and the sympathy that consumers of the media are supposed to be feeling for the characters. I take a big influence from the horror author Jack Ketchum on this. Like, he has some of the most vile shit ever in his books, but you never feel like it's being shown as a spectacle for your entertainment. Like, it makes you feel for the characters because you have gotten to know them and to care about them and things like that. And I think that horror fiction can be a very cathartic thing because you are, in a way that doesn't actually injure you, engaging with how awful this world and things that are in it can be. And, like, what does it mean to live in a world where this can happen to you or someone that you know? And, like, salvaging meaning and hope out of that darkness is, like, the entire theme of the Orpheus Protocol as a campaign, as, like, an epic story that's being told. And, like, kind of just that whole existentialist philosophy stuff, honestly, is a big thing in the campaign and really probably anything fictional that I do because it preoccupies me.
Is that tone something you have to, like, do you use any sort of tools to make sure that, hey, I want this show to feel like this, and you, like, do a check-in with yourself every session, or do you kind of just hope that future Rob will get it correct?
I'm going to be, warts and all honest here. A little column A, a little column B, because sometimes I don't have enough time to plan the next session. I just have to hope.
Right.
I have, the next session is, like, I got the people together. They can record in, 2 hours. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's just the nature of the beast. When, especially later on, I don't know how far you've listened, but getting into season 2, the cast gets bigger and bigger, which is something that I've been wanting to do from the get-go because of the possibility that we have now playing role-playing games online through the internet with players remote from each other. I was like, why hasn't any actual play podcast done a Game of Thrones style narrative where you have different points of view?
Yes.
One world where a bunch of crazy crap is happening, but like in different places, people are focused on different things and are forming and breaking from different groups and stuff. And I was like, I want to do that in an actual play. The answer is that it sucks and it makes a lot of work and the HR, like, scheduling aspect of it is pure nightmare fuel. But like, that's probably why most people don't do that. But I have been doing that, and sometimes that ends up being like, oh look, I literally have to run 3 recordings on 3 consecutive days with different people and stuff like that. But when I have time, I do try to think about that. And one of the key things there is that the amount of stock character or caricature that someone's allowed to be in Orpheus is inversely proportional to their screen time. Like, if someone's going to be around and talking and having opinions and having any kind of impact in the story, we need to understand, or at least I need to understand, to portray them properly. What drives them, what they're afraid of, what they love. There aren't that many just pure mustache-twirling villains. When there are, I revel in how extra they can be as a contrast. But like, there's a lot of moral gray in the show because that's more like real life. Like, there's something to like about even some of the vilest people. If you can take that one quality out of context, which of course you can't, which is why we fight. But I think I'm drawn towards that concept of the moral grayness of people because it just tells better stories. Like in a game where the most fun way for the players to interact with the world is making hard decisions. It just isn't as fun if it's a clear cut, we gotta take this dude out. It's more fun if there's a little bit of grayness to it, if there's a little bit of arguing. Yeah, I agree. Your show's really good, man. I'm not that far. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna do a beep here. Sorry, listeners. I just got to...
Gosh, okay. Yeah, I think you're probably closing in on the last couple arcs of season 1 then.
Speaking of your show, I'm not gonna spoil anything. One of the main characters acquires this item that's very important to them and it's very important to their character. How much did you and that player talk about that item before it came into play? Like, did you guys have that whole arc sort of planned, or was it, hey, I need to get this thing at some point, how can we work it into the story, we'll play it by ear?
I'm trying to remember, because this has now been 3 years.
Oh shit, yeah, you're so, right, huh? Yeah.
Since that was recorded. But Dan and I talked a lot about his character and how his character was going to work before we did anything. And like the rivalry with another person who wielded a different sword, who was his friend and betrayed him, and the idea of him being a cyborg but actually a weapon bearer, and his leveling up isn't him getting more powerful, it's him remembering more of himself. That was all stuff that like we came up with beforehand, and like that bizarre, really fucking awesome arc of remembering yourself instead of getting stronger was all Dan's idea.
It's a very cliche arc, but I was very surprised, very happy with how you guys took it. I think it's a really unique take on that arc.
I have enjoyed it a lot. I imagine the idea of like the Mordred figure in Walter was my idea. I don't remember who came up with it being a baseball bat. No, I don't think we said explicitly when we were like, okay, we're taking the story back to your hometown, you're going to get the baseball bat. I think I just gave him the baseball bat, and like he was like,
Very
of course there's a baseball bat. Like, of course that's where it is, and like I can get it, and that's like the start of something.
The scenes leading up to the point where he got his baseball bat, like I was sold at the beginning, and then we got there, and I think that sort of encapsulates what you're talking about with the emotion of the game. That, man, like it hits you hard on both sides, Yeah. And there's a lot of crueler ways that could have been handled, like a lot of really mean ways. And instead it was just, I don't know, it was a really nice moment.
I think the show shows itself to be effective at horror and suspense and stuff pretty much right away. But I would argue that you need to listen to 16 episodes and get through the overdue book arc, Mitch's flashback arc, to be totally sold on like the emotional side of the story.
Man, if you're listening to APs, you probably give them 20 episodes, right? Like if they're well produced, if it's well edited.
Well, I mean, there's various things that can kick me off, but like, yeah, like I give a lot of time to make sure, because it does take a while to develop. So as long as there's nothing that's like a total deal breaker, I'll keep listening for a pretty good long while before giving up. Because it's like if there's no definite like, okay, this audio is never getting better, or okay, this just isn't edited. I hear like snack mouth sounds and like constant rules clarifications and people looking up stuff in books and like, getting up from the table and stuff. Or like, something thematic like, oh, this is a racist podcast. Like obviously that's like instant. But like, if there's nothing like that, I'll listen to it for a fairly long time and give it a chance to grow. I don't know quite how long I listened before I'm like, okay, this is kind of settled into this is where it's at, and that's not enough for me to listen to 100 episodes of it. But like, it's a pretty long time, as long as it's not doing anything actively horrible.
Yeah. It seems to me like we have very similar tastes in actual plays, because I don't know, I try to listen to a lot, and I feel like most people just not take the time to edit. And that's like 80% of it, like.
Oh yeah, no, that's by far the most work, and it's mind-numbing.
Yes, very much so. Is there anything like you've learned, like what's the biggest lesson you've learned in making your show and not the game?
I mean, we've hinted at already. Editing actual play content down to optimal listenability is a absolutely insane amount of work. And if you're doing it at top quality and releasing weekly, it's honestly like almost impossible if it's not either your full-time job or literally the only thing you do other than your job. Because not only do you have to clean it up, obviously, removing weird noises and cups getting set down and dogs barking and chairs creaking there's smaller things as well. Like if someone says something with like in the center of it, or an awkwardly repeated syllable like I just did, you can just cut it out, okay, but it'll sound better if you fade out the end of what comes right before it and fade in what comes right after it, then put them together. It takes much longer. And it doesn't take a huge amount of time, but it takes longer. And if you're doing it hundreds and hundreds of times, it adds up. But it does sound better. you can also move around and retime things to make it sound like people were talking over each other less than they were. Not that I've ever done that. Which really helps. It helps the listener understand and parse what's going on. It makes it much more intelligible. Manually adjusting volumes, because like you can compress and, you know, set a top volume, but depending on the dynamic range of like how someone is speaking, it may be optimal to make manual adjustments to some of the things that they say. That's still more time. And then if you're doing music, don't take my advice, because the way that I do music takes way too long.
Ooh, now I'm curious.
Most people will just drop a track in, play it beginning to end, and set the highest volume peak of that music track such that the vocals are still understandable above it. Okay, that's fine. What I do is I find a good median point for the music, and I listen to what's going on in the vocals, both dynamic range-wise and thematically, and I manually sculpt the audio track to rise higher and drop lower along the way. So that there can be things like, you know, big spikes of volume in the music where something exciting happens or whatever, or fading slower and slower as someone's like kind of or fading lower and lower as someone's kind of leaning into something where you expect maybe something scary is going to happen, things like that. And then I go real nuts and manually retime what people are saying to fit with the music rhythmically.
Oh shit, now that's another level. I was nodding my head through this and I was like, okay, okay, I do that. That's insane, Rob.
I don't always do that, but there are times that I hear where the music is falling versus what's happening. I was like, oh, this part of the song fits with what he said here. So is there any way that I can do this without like overplaying my hand? And like most episodes have at least some instances of me manually retiming things so that the music subtly cheats to make the emotional impact higher.
Oh man, dude, that's intense.
You know, as I was saying, like the last episode of Overdue Book, like the big climax of that episode, listen again and pay real close attention to like what the music is doing while what the players are saying.
I mean, it was great. It was great.
That was the result of, that was when I discovered it, that technique. And by the end, I will say that it was 8:00 in the morning the next day. But I was like playing 30 seconds at a time, fiddling. And then like by the end, I was like jumping up and down and running around my office. Like,
man, isn't that the problem? Like, you will just consistently, it's the same thing as GMing, right? Like, you're going to just find more and more techniques that can make it a little bit better. Mm-hmm. And it never stops. It just never stops.
But we live under capitalism in rotting meat sacks, which is a big problem.
Oh man, dude, Rob, okay, fuck the listeners for a second. I can talk to no one else about this, dude, and this makes me so happy. I just feel justified. I feel vindicated for all the time I've spent. Man, it makes me feel so good.
No, your show's one of the only ones I can stand listening to.
You all play remotely, and so you have a little more flexibility. I can't really play around with the people that are at the table.
Right, how they speak relative to one another, yeah.
Right, yeah. But most of the time, they do a good job. I don't think I could play around with that for music, but I do always, like, I'll go for the end of the music first. Like, that's what I'll sync up, and then I'll figure out where I can bring it in. Where you can
fade it in and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's so much. I mean, most people don't edit out crosstalk and table talk and likes, ums, and uhs. So what you're doing is many levels ahead of that.
Yeah, I suppose.
Most people are just... hot take. Most people who make AP are simply not willing/able to put in the amount of work that it takes to make it pleasantly listenable to an audience.
Yeah. I assume you do as well, but like I cut bad lines. Like if somebody says something cheesy or they say something redundant.
Oh yeah,
or
yeah. If it turns
fit.
out it's better, like a lot of times when people are playing, they'll say something and then they'll think of something that has a higher impact that gets the same idea across, and they'll say it again. Yeah. Because they feel like they need to say it. And I'll be like, that was the right instinct.
And we'll even get to the point where like someone will be at the end of the episode and they're like, hey, Caleb, 2 hours ago, can you just put in this line?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there have been a couple really bad things. Like there was one time that because of just the vicissitudes of recording with so many different people on different schedules and stuff, there was a pretty long gap and we played out a whole session with a gigantic fucking plot hole in it. And like that was the worst. That was the second worst, I should say. The worst was when we played an entire session of one of the things that patrons get as a bonus, a whole other campaign that's coming out for them, where my microphone was selected to the wrong microphone for like a 3 hour and 45-minute session.
Christ.
So I had to edit the whole thing, listen to other people for context, write myself a script, and re-record everything.
Oh my God, that is brutal, man. How long did that take you?
It was like 49 hours of work.
Oh my God.
That was probably the worst thing I've ever had to do. It was absolutely shit.
Hey, you'll never make that mistake again, right?
Hell no.
That's all that matters, dude.
Pain is an excellent teacher.
Something that does make me very jealous of your actual play. I'm just going to tell you a story. I started listening to you, and then I called Cameron Reed, who's a player on my game, and we generally talk like once or twice a week. He runs all the social media and stuff, and he's always pushing me to do marketing stuff. So generally we just talk, so I'm not a huge piece of garbage and don't just do nothing all week. And I started talking about your show, and I was like, dude, this show is really good. You need to listen to it. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, I'll listen to it, whatever, you know. And that kept going for a while. And then I kept calling him, and I was like, dude, this guy's descriptions, these are insane. I can't keep up with this. Like his vocabulary, the way he describes stuff, like I'm never going to get to this level. And like the third time I called him in a week, he was like, listen, dude, you need to stop listening to this show. Okay, you're a good GM. You don't need to beat yourself up with this. Okay, he's like, he edits that shit, dude. We edit our shit, dude. Don't hold yourself to that standard. Chill out, man. And then I stopped listening for like 2 weeks, and then I came back, and it was better. But
I'm so sorry.
I'm homeschooled, so maybe it's just my bias of uneducated, nonsense. But you have an incredible evocative vocabulary for your descriptions, for your narration, and it's something I think I've gotten better at. Like I remember the first time I listened to like One Shot, I listened to James D'Amato, and I was like, holy shit, this dude is really good, and I feel like I'm getting better, and I'm pretty good, but I feel like you take it to a whole nother level. Is that just something that's from your background, or is that a skill that you actively practice?
Well, I guess you could say that I practice it because so much of what I do is now publicly consumed that I do have a relentless drive to try to improve on things like that, or at least maintain a high level of quality, because nothing I do will not be judged by hundreds of people. So, that's a good motivator. But honestly, I wish that I had better advice for how to get that skill. It's decades of horror and fantasy media consumption. It's just reading a lot. And like, cause I was a very bookish kid. I read a lot of books. I wish that I had time to. Honestly, I would read a lot more books if I were not working on this all the time now. It's one of the things that haunts me, is my TBR pile reaching, lower Earth orbit. It's just I've been reading speculative fiction since I was able to read, and always, I guess, mentally keeping a track of things that hit you really, like, emotionally resonated very strongly, and thinking about, okay, how did this author do that? And I do have, like my formal training is English. It's an English degree that I have, which has done me no good materially, except perhaps for if it is partially to blame for me being able to do a good job on a podcast. Which I guess it's hard to say how big a role it had in it, but certainly thinking about how narratives work, thinking about how different language techniques in storytelling work or don't work, has been a main focus of mine for many, many years now, whether for school or for desperately trying to not have to, work in IT again.
Are you like part-time? Are you
no, Orpheus is my job right now.
That's awesome.
The Kickstarter is going well enough that I think for at least one more year that will be true. I have been on the very edge of having to go back to the office job situation multiple times, and always managed to scrape by the skin of my teeth, and by basically my wife making more money than I do, and me being incredibly cheap to take care of.
Oh, hell yeah. That's
like,
what I'm talking about.
Whatever, like, I have incredibly inexpensive tastes. I will just wear the same shoes until they fall apart on my feet and stuff like that, because I value my time more than money almost all the time, like 9 cases of 10. And if I can eat garbage and, like, have crappy clothes and do Orpheus as a job instead of, like, having some more luxuries, but having to give up 8-10 hours a day to something that doesn't create something beautiful, that's the choice that I make, is to to be a bit of an ascetic when it comes to material things. My computer's Windows 7, my man. Like, I feel like George R.R. Martin up here with my green on black screen.
Man, that's
typing.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely we're nowhere near the level that I could do what you're doing. And so I'm definitely stuck in that grind you're talking about, where I was just nodding my head the whole time, where it's 40-hour job, come home and edit.
I mean, that's what I was doing before. And I couldn't do that now, though. I probably could still make Orpheus, just barely, not quite at the quality level, because as you said, you keep discovering new techniques that make it, it's only an hour more and it makes it 0.01% better, so obviously it's worth it. But all the other stuff, like my Patreon, is something that I'm actually legitimately proud of, not in like the number that I'm pulling in what I give for it. I have not found any podcasts that give the level of bonus content and rewards and stuff that I do, and that's why it's my full-time job, because like it takes just as much time as making the show to keep up with all the bonus stuff.
You like run games for people? You what else do you do?
Well, let's just pull up the old Patreon, because I'm gonna forget plenty of stuff here.
If you're gonna plug, now's the time to plug, dude. That's what I say.
So on the Orpheus Protocol, of course, like anybody, I'll thank you on air. If you give me a little tiny amount of money, but I try to create the thanks as something in character with an NPC that has some sort of tie-in to what's going on in the story, so it's a little bit more thoughtful than just like, here, thank you, other person. I try to tie it into what's going on with the story. At $5 a month, though, it gets a little bit nuts because I'm putting out bloopers. There are full shows where, like, John and I discuss movies and television shows. There's a interview show, not unlike this, where I have different people on to talk about different topics. There is a full campaign of fully produced actual play in an alternate world to Orpheus that John is running as GM. I'm a player in. And you get all of that and more at the $5 level. Like, really wanted to structure my Patreon page to really push people to go to the $5 level. $10 level or more, you can ask questions live on the interview shows, and there are a couple of even higher level bonuses. Some side episodes to the Campfire, which is my long-form narrative theory discussion podcast with Quinn Welsh Wilson, and a couple of bonus Orpheus adventures, things like that. And then I start getting into stuff like I give you custom dice, you are in a lottery to come play video games with me, then I'll give you a t-shirt, some super special occasional podcasts and fiction pieces type things at a higher level. And then if you want to get really ridiculous and give me a ton of money, you can join the ongoing campaign that's also being recorded and will eventually be released to the archive because it's going really well. That one's sold out, though, because I don't want my whole life to be just trying to earn those dollars, because then I just won't actually make the show anymore. But like I said, the office job is now impossible if I keep the Patreon at the level it's at, because
Christ.
I do just as much work on bonus stuff for patrons as I do for making the show. But I think that may be why it is successful to a degree, is like I'm doing basically a similar level of output to a lot of like podcast networks, and it's just me. But like, again, the lengths I will go to not have to go be in a fluorescent lit room with a bunch of people I don't know and all that.
Dude, I gotta step up my Patreon game. That's what I gotta do.
I mean,
Jesus Christ,
but I only
content.
got there by floating on a raft of unthinkable privilege. You know, like my wife supported me for like a year while I was trying to make it work, and it took a while to climb up, in the Patreon dollars to the point where it was feasible. But like, I just barely made it. And now the Kickstarter's trying to buy me enough leeway that I can be safe for a year and think of ways to either market myself better or like work on another project or whatever, because, I'm still in poverty.
Yeah, that's very cool, man. I feel like whenever my wife is like, "Hey, do you care if I do X?" I'm just like, "Yeah, do it, dude." I tell like once every 2 weeks I tell you to go in our room and just stay quiet for 4 hours. Like I treat you like a trash human. You can do whatever you want,
I feel that 100%, 150%.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's sure more for you. Absolutely.
You're not allowed to make any noise because some people that you don't know and never will know are pretending to be secret agents with me. Like, it doesn't feel great to tell your spouse that, but sometimes that's how it be.
Man. Okay. Well, Rob, is there any unsolicited advice you've got for the masses? Is there any one thing that you think everybody should be doing when it comes to RPGs?
Okay, the number one thing, I think, probably, if you distill it down, like one thing that predicts success the best, make the story about the player characters. This is not just for the benefit of each player, emotionally investing because of the things that have to do with them and their backstory, but this means that the points of interest that you're playing in the campaign often have some personal relevance to one or more characters, which means that you're going to start getting emotional investment between the players, between the different characters and the other characters. And that's really good. It's much better than just like, here, you guys are the spectators, the uninvolved spectators that we have to sort of suspend disbelief a little bit about why you're together, why you're on this journey, and why you're going through all this horrible stuff. And, have a session 0 following from that so that you can make sure that everybody's characters would work well together and, in fact, would be the adventurers. Because, like, if someone's going to be like, well, I just want to bake pies, it's like,
Harper.
Okay, well, you're baking pies on the road to Mordor, dude. And if that's not okay with you, okay, yeah, that guy goes back to the Shire. Tell me about the guy who's actually coming.
But Hot Pie is the best Game of Thrones character, Rob.
I think he won, at least at the point in the story that I'm at. Like, hey, look, I can practice my craft here. But, like, it's not as though he has very many scenes after that, huh?
Yeah.
Make sure that each character has enough backstory to hook multiple times and multiple ways into the main adventure, but, don't require people to exhaustively do everything, because sometimes some mystery is good. My policy with players is stuff that you definitely want to be true in your backstory, tell me. Stuff that you are not okay with having in your backstory, tell me. And everything else, all that extra space, like, I'm going to spring stuff on you from there on. Because the more you can have the story be personally involving of the player characters, just the healthier the story is going to stay forever. Because that's like an implicit reason that they're going to be interested and invested in it.
Well, I think we took that advice on my show, so I think we're good.
Oh, yeah, no, your show really passes that test. Indeed. Like, that was one of the things that I was in just the very first episode, I was very happy about. It's like, okay, this actually is about these boys. So that's like, the story is about the right people. So that's really good, because that's like a problem that a shocking number of these things have, actually. Man,
that is very good advice. I feel like there's a lot of very generic, session. What's the word? It's too micro on the sessions themselves, instead of thinking about the
health of
goals?
A long-term game is something that's completely ignored in most RPG advice things. Again, I should mention, on patreon.com/Orpheus Protocol, the campfire is free. You don't actually have to be a pledged patron to listen to it. And that is the show where Quinn and I are going to be going step by exhaustive step, talking about how to conceive, prepare, and run a successful long-term campaign that really focuses on telling a good story and keeping it going. So I do urge everyone to check that out, whether you have any intent of supporting the Orpheus Protocol or not. It's that's something that I was not going to charge money for. I wanted everyone to be able to have it.
Well, in addition to that, where else can people find you online?
I, as we discussed, am at Lord of the Stith, Stith. But the show, of course, is at Orpheus Protocol. We're on orpheusprotocol.com. Search us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, whatever you want. And presently, we're on Kickstarter. So go ahead and just search the Orpheus Protocol there if you want to.
100% funded.
Oh, yeah. We funded in 74 minutes.
Hell yeah. That is a good thing to hear.
And like, we're very close now to getting the book to the level that I really wanted it to be, like, ideally. Expanding the art budget, because I found a frankly ridiculously awesome artist for this, and I want to pay him to make many more pictures for me, not just a few more. So we're getting close to that, to the book ascending to its final form, and then we're going to start getting into the really exciting, fun stretch goals.
Hell yeah, dude. Well, thanks for coming on, man. This was a lot of fun, and to everybody else, see you Monday, I guess. Thanks to Rob for coming on the show. I had a ton of fun with this episode. It was really nice to hear someone goes through the same editing pains that I go through every week. That was probably my favorite part of this. I posted links to the Kickstarter in the show notes, which I have backed and you should as well, along with all of his other projects that you can find online. Even if you can't support the Kickstarter, like, listen to his show. I mean, just an episode I think is enough to sell you. It is stylistically so similar. I feel like I can say with confidence that if you like crows, there's a pretty high chance you'll like the Orpheus Protocol. Thanks to Katie George for introducing me to the show, and to everybody else, thank you for listening.